Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
I'm always looking for ways to show my cat how much I love her. And with Fancy Feast gems, I can pamper her whenever I want with a savory gravy on top of a gourmet mousse pâté. The pyramid shape makes serving simple, so all I have to do is peel and plate to make mealtime feel extra fancy. And with 2 entrees in every pack, it's easy to turn every day into the extraordinary. Fancy Feast gems.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. Christopher Jansma's latest novel, Our Narrow Hiding Places, casts us back in history to the Netherlands of the Hungry Winter under German occupation during World War II. Following his protagonist, Mieke Geborn's recounting of the story of her childhood in a coastal town in Holland, we move forward and backward in time, from the present day of Miike's life on the New Jersey shore, where her grandson Will is visiting after a visible crack in his marriage, and the past of Miike's involvement in the hiding of family and neighbors from German labor camps and deportation, and her hopefulness and optimism for perhaps something different, a better life, with her ersatz cousin Rob would eventually become her husband. A masterful recreation of a moment in Dutch life and crisis that is often forgotten amid the spectacular losses of the Holocaust and the Axis and Allied firebombings. Jansma's Our Narrow Hiding Places is a novel of ethical choices as perceived by children who are forced into the position of adults, the caretakers of spydom and hunger before the Allies would eventually arrive. Miike's oral history and the epigenetical inheritance that Will shares with her make for a heartrending and unforgettable read. Christopher grew up in Lincroft, New Jersey. He received his BA from the writing seminars from Johns Hopkins University and an M.F.A. in fiction from Columbia University. He is the author of the critically acclaimed novels Our Narrow Hiding Places, Why We Came to the City, and The Unchangeable Spots of Leopards. His book of essays on the creative process is Revisionaries, what we can learn from the lost, unfinished, and just plain bad work of great writers. Kristopher is the director of the creative writing program at SUNY New Paltz. Welcome to the show, Kristopher Jansma.
Hi, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
It's such a pleasure. I am a fan of your previous novels, in particular, The Unchangeable Spots of Leopards. And so I was very excited to get a chance to read this, what I think of as a real departure from some of your other work. And I wonder what drew you to the history of this terrible drive for survival in Nazi-occupied Holland.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's the first time I've written anything sort of in this historical vein. I had written maybe a couple short stories that were set in the past before, but most of my work has been set in contemporary, life. And I started working on this actually during the pandemic. I was calling my grandmother, who I call Oma, Dutch word for grandmother. I was calling my Oma, who lived alone in central New Jersey, close to where I grew up. I'm calling her every week to check in, make sure she was doing okay. She lives alone. And obviously during COVID in March of 2020, things were very scary. And, was worried about her.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we started talking every week and catch up on what was going on, in the midst of pandemic life. And a lot of it was reminding her of her childhood during the war and and thinking about, sort of being stuck at home and being very scared and not sure about where food would come from and other resources. And at the time, I was at home here in Westchester with my young son, who was 8 years old, who's turned out to be exactly the same age that she was at the end of the war, stuck in her apartment in The Hague, in
Oh
the
my goodness.
Netherlands. Yeah. And so it was really interesting. So then hearing some of these stories, many of which I'd heard before, but I'd never really been able to kind of quite connect to them. But something about hearing them, thinking about my son being the same age and trying to imagine what the world of the pandemic looked like through his eyes, it all came together in a way that really surprised me and excited me. And then I started seeing the possibilities for writing this novel.
That's an amazing one, sort of like commonality of age, but also something wonderful that came out of COVID and an attachment to oral history, which I think I feel like we just miss so much from our older generations, and this inheritance that we could have that we miss out. And your grandmother, your Oma, must have loved getting to pass that along.
Yeah, in some ways, I think, this is a story that she's wanted to tell herself for a long time. She actually studied creative writing. She went to community college in New Jersey when I was just a kid, and took some writing classes and wrote a few little stories about her memories of the war, which, she had published in the sort of, college literary journal, which I now have copies of those pieces. And then as I grew up and I was becoming a novelist and writing, she often would sort of, suggest, would you ever be interested in writing something about the war? And I kept putting it off. I just felt like, I don't know, I'm not sure I know how to write a historical novel, and other things I'm working on, and something about, being during the pandemic, having that time and realizing, there's a limit, a limit to how long we're going to have her around to hear these stories. And I need to get this written down now, especially in that moment when it seemed like everything could go off the rails very quickly. We could have lost her. So yeah, she was 83 years old at the time. She's 87 years old now, thankfully still with us and doing very well. And I feel really lucky to be able to sort of use her story as a jumping off point for this.
And I assume she's read it.
Yes, I did not let her read it until it was finished and basically in galleys.
Okay.
And I was a little nervous that, because, I'm a fiction writer, and I obviously started with these sort of interviews with her and working as best as I could from her memories of, what happened. I filled in quite a lot through my own research and reading other survivors' accounts. And as my imagination goes into it, things change and other elements enter in. So I became more and more nervous as I was writing that she was going to be expecting basically a memoir, or a biography of her life, and that she was going to be surprised to find, sort of a novel with all sorts of other elements woven in. But luckily, thankfully, she, of course, I think understood better than I imagined what I was
a creative
trying to do
writer herself. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So she sort of saw the path that I took with it, and she was very happy with where it ended up.
Oh, that's great. I love that. So there are intermediary chapters in our narrow hiding places that are stories told by a writer that have the conceit of being spoken by eels, and eels who carry a kind of deep time memory of the Netherlands long before humans sort of basically floated a trash island up to become what is the Netherlands, almost directly at sea level, and that carry on in a way something like Walter Benjamin's idea of the angel of history, staring back at the exploits and suffering of humans and being able to kind of carry that memory and survive no matter what. And I wonder if you could give us a taste of that by reading a little bit of one of those intermediary chapters and maybe set us up a little bit with the context.
Sure. So yeah, these eels speak throughout the novel at periods in a sort of collective first person plural. And they, just as you described, Chris, they stand somewhat outside of the normal timeline of the story. In the beginning, giving some context to these events that are happening in World War II, they're able to look back in history to, Holland when it was part of the Roman Empire, and even before that, when it was part of the Napoleonic Empire afterwards. And so the eels start off as sort of almost kind of like a wide angle lens on time. And then at a certain point in the novel, and this is the section I'm going to share now, they follow one of the characters in the novel who has run away and is fleeing capture by the Nazis. And they were a way for me to bring the story into one of the concentration camps in southern Holland, where some of the story
Vegetable City, is that right?
Yeah, the camp is called Camp Grante in the novel. In real life, the concentration camp in southern Holland was called Vught. And my grandmother, when I spoke with Oma over the phone about this, she kept saying Vught, 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 and I kept looking it up, and it came up as the word for fruit in Dutch. And VUGHT is the word for fruit. The real camp was Vught, VUCHT. And so I had them confused for a long time in my notes. And I had, by that point, already sort of fallen in love with this idea of a concentration camp named after a major food group.
Yeah, I love it too.
And so it became part of the story. It's sort of a way of, it's obviously very difficult to write about concentration camp. And I wanted to find a way to make it feel, both horrifying and also somewhat light and magical in its way. So this was my approach to that. All right. But our author has only just arrived. He fled the rocket-lined beaches of Den Haag, moving on foot by cover of night. Like one of us, he swam and crawled and slid and slithered past the Hook of Holland, along the branching waters of the Rip, and out beyond the ruined docks of Rotterdam. Hiding, sliding, moving in the night, our author came along the river wall and into the silted moss. At last, he stumbled into the boggy wetlands of Bijsbach, and was captured alongside a caravan of M.F.A gypsies brought with them to Camp Grante. Now all we can do is watch after him from the river as he stands at the barbed wire fences, staring out at the heaths past the guard towers. It is a bleak sight. We cannot lie about that. Life in a concentration camp, even one named after cruciferous foods, is no laughing matter. There are thousands of people all around. Each day 100 more arrive and 100 more are slaughtered. Shot over the gravel pits, burned alive. They hung people for a while, but it must have been too slow going. In any case, they don't do it nearly as much anymore, we have noticed. How is it, you ask, that we are so indifferent? It is because we've swum alongside your so-called history for centuries, passing every bloody battlefield, every burned village, the purges of one holy crusade after another. But we must admit this time it has all been more difficult to witness. The timeline of human extinction speeds along with increasing velocity. Each day more are executed or are taken away to be executed elsewhere. We don't pretend to understand, nor does our author. Why they kill some now and some later. Why some here and some there. It is unknowable. Even the Germans do not know, though they like to imagine they know everything. It is laughable, truly, how little they know. They do not even know who our author is. You see, as he fled, he was rather stupidly unprepared. For some reason, the only thing he grabbed before scrambling away was a single forged identification card. Worse, one that turned out to be only partially filled out. It listed his name as just Schrijver, with no surname or address. When the Nazis took him in and came across his papers, they asked him, "Mr. Author, what kinds of books do you write?" And he did not respond. He has not spoken since he left home. Eventually, they put him down in their records as Schrijver, ? And this, we suppose, was taken literally by some other Nazi at some other point in the intake process. And so now he is officially prisoner 237040102, Schrijver Vragstikken, V.S. Oh, dear author, you are frightened, yes. You do not know how long it will take them to figure out who you actually are, or if they ever will. What can we do but whisper it to you through the walls? What can we do but tell you these old tales? A part of yourself you have eaten back home to look after your son, A part of yourself you hide here on these pages. What's left cannot always be seen, cannot speak, cannot feel as before. If you could feel, if your soul were restored, it would kill you. Heinousness and fear are numbing. Everything becomes banal with repetition. And yet you hunt sometimes for beauty in this hell. We cry to you, no, do not. We can hide you from fear, but beauty reveals us. Whenever you find some shadows moving in a pleasing pattern or a half-torn copy of a Tolstoy novel, even the bracing chill of the falling rain, these can only reawaken your hidden soul. Why did you think you were captured in the first place? The folk songs of the Vajra you heard from your haystack. You were revealed. You believe this is somehow better than being numb, dead before you are dead. You humans are so exasperating. Must we remind you how an eel survives in a well for a century? Let us implore you, remove yourself from this, you fleshy fool. Wait it out. Do not admire the way the late day light gleams off the barbs on a wire fence, or the ragged order of the stars above you at night. Do not think about Hieronymus Bosch or Henry I, Duke of Brabant. Be free, we say, of history. Be free, we say, of time. And yet, you insist. You hum those very same Ashtvajara songs to yourself in the bleak night. You giggle at the prospect of dying in a place called Camp Vegetable. With unbridled appreciation, you stare off at the forest and see the creatures that now dead medieval highnesses once hunted there. Foxes, wolves, hares, pheasants. You imagine a new life, reborn as a free creature who, like us, can cross the narrow canyon that splits the landscape, a crack that leads past the straw-thatched roofs of those peasant farmers. It will happen soon enough, we know. Until then, we whisper on to you, and you will listen on to us, concealed and circling in the waters. We will protect you until we can do so no longer. And with some quietly tended excitement, you will write our tales down for us as best you can. V.I.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was wonderful. And I'm very interested to hear you talk a little bit about the idea of this deep and sort of broad memory that extends beyond the time of man and in a way is a recording agent, but also part of the story.
Yeah, originally the novel in its sort of earlier drafts, it had what I was trying to do was sort of weave in various sort of folk tales, Dutch folk tales into the story, because that was one way I wanted to sort of connect with the deeper culture of the Dutch people. One of my challenges in writing the book was that, I've grown up as sort of a Dutch American, I suppose, second generation. My father was born here, but his parents immigrated over in the 50s. And I didn't really ever have like a very strong connection to being Dutch. I didn't really know what it meant to be a Dutch person. We don't have like a great cuisine or, wonderful traditions that everybody knows about.
The McDonald's Snack Wrap is back. You brought it back. Ranch Snack Wrap. Spicy Snack Wrap. You broke the internet for a snack. Snack Wrap is back. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Finding a new job is stressful. But with Indeed, it doesn't have to be. Just fill out your Indeed profile with your skills, experience, and desired salary. The more you fill out, the better your matches will be. And hearing from hiring managers will be 2 times more likely. Relax. That's your Indeed profile sending opportunities your way. Indeed, the world can work better.
You have that moment when you convey a joke that is that you don't like people with cultural intolerance or the Dutch, because it's such a blanded idea for most people who are not Dutch that you can't take offense at it.
Yeah, there's a moment in the book where the narrator, one of the characters, Will, is sort of closer in age to me, recalls seeing, I think it's Austin Powers 3 in the movie theater, and this was the first time I'd ever heard anybody make a joke about the Dutch. And there's a line about how the character hates all people who are intolerant and the Dutch. And it was, it's funny because, hating the Dutch doesn't mean anything because we don't have any, there's nothing there to hate. So I was playing off of that idea, and I wanted to get in touch with something, kind of even deeper down. So I thought about going to the folk tales that Dutch culture, sort of originally was built upon. I found a an old book of Dutch fairy tales, and I started reading them and sort of weaving them into the story. I wanted the character of Mika as an 8-year-old girl growing up during the war to be struggling with, she's a very sort of cold, rational girl in some ways. And then her cousin Rob believes in magic and fairies and things like that. And slowly, as things get more and more off the rails for her and her family during the war, the magic starts to sort of emerge around her, and she starts seeing things that she can't explain. So the eels were originally sort of part of that process. I was sort of looking for a narrator that could get into deeper past parts of the Dutch culture and heritage, and then they became this, as I was just sort of saying before, they became a way for me to move out of Mika's sort of limited perspective in the novel, because she is a child and there's only so much she's able to sort of see from where she is. And I really wanted the novel to be able to take us to places like the camp where the prisoners are being held. It seemed in some ways sort of immoral to me to write a World War II novel that didn't, that sort of not ignored, but sort of overlooked, the things that were happening in those camps. And so I really wanted to make sure that the novel was able to see into those places. And the eels were sort of the perfect way to do that.
And the eels have a survival instinct that's talked about with that eel who survives, conceivably in the magical realism, for an incredible amount of time in a well, only to, persist. And there's a sense of the way in which Mika has a kind of like eel-like nature to her in that she will persist.
Yeah, the eels also became exactly a way to sort of talk about what it means to survive something horrible like this. And so in that section, they're urging him, right, to sort of, shut himself down to some degree and hide himself in order to survive. One of the folktales that I ran across was this really beautiful one about sort of more like an urban legend or like a rural legend about a boy who drops an eel into a well and then it closes the well up, and then over the course of his life, continually comes back and feels guilty about it, and wonders, if there's some way to make up for this kind of cruel thing he did as a child. And then he goes and opens the well back up again, and the eel comes flying out.
There it is.
There it is. 80 years later. And in reality, apparently eels do live like incredibly long lifespans. People don't know.
I have no idea.
Yeah, apparently it's all a little mysterious. Scientists have managed now recently actually to figure out a little bit more about where they reproduce and how they do. But they seem to have naturally very long lifespans. And so that was just kind of perfect for these.
Fascinating. So at the beginning of Mika's recounting of what the occupation is like to her grandson, Will, there's a kind of quasi-normalcy to her childhood. And, the bakeries keep baking, and there are cakes and there are bread, and there's the daily rhythms of life. And Nazis are around, but they're not kind of an indomitable force. And then Mika begins to see that people are disappearing. And I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about how that's often a missing story, that sort of transitional period in which there's a kind of, quasi-normalcy.
Yeah. Yeah, this was something that really surprised me as I started getting into the actual history of Holland during the war. I guess I've always imagined it would be something like what I'd seen in movies or read in books about, France and, people fighting and, villages being ripped apart and all these kinds of things. And in fact, relatively little of that happened really mostly towards the very end of the war. What happened in Holland was that they basically capitulated very early on. There was a bombing of Rotterdam in 1940 that just destroyed the entire city and killed thousands. And then almost immediately after that, the Dutch, surrendered or capitulated is the word that they use. And in exchange for that, they became part of the German occupation. The Queen fled to London and was living in exile there. But the people were granted, sort of relief. So they were under Nazi control, but they were able to live like relatively normal lives for many years on into, 1944, as the rest of Europe was, being torn apart. And so one thing I discovered, ended up going to Holland in 2022 to some museums there to see I wanted to really understand, like, how did the Dutch understand what happened during the war and how did they think about it? And it was really interesting. They really focus on the moral implications of that question, right? If you are, if in fact, one of the museums, you walk in and there's sort of this little video and it sort of, welcomes you to the Resistance Museum or the Freedom Museum. And it says, imagine you wake up one morning, you're going about your normal life and your country's been taken over by a fascist dictatorship from abroad. And I was thinking, thinking back on the Trump years and thinking like, okay, I can sort of imagine what it's like suddenly to have my country overtaken by, people I don't love. And so then the video says, you have three options, right? Now you can become a sympathizer and sort of align yourself with those forces. You can join the resistance and become somebody who like actively fights against it, or you can do what most people did, which is sort of live unhappily under the occupation and try to just get through your life. And suddenly that really rang to me as something I could connect with. And that's what, of course, I think my actual relatives would have done. They were not sympathizers. And in fact, they did end up doing things that, in resistance to the occupation. But like most of the Dutch people living in The Hague, they were also just trying to survive, just trying to get through the war in one piece and take care of their family and so on. The trade-off for that, of course, is that they turned a blind eye to the deportation and arrest of so many Jews in that country. I think it's something like 90% of the Jewish population of Holland was taken and murdered. And to varying degrees, right? People knew what was happening or turned a blind eye to it. So Mika, of course, at 8 years old in the novel, is somewhat innocent of this, right? She's still a child, but she understands by the end of the novel that this is something that her parents are aware of and struggling with, to try to figure out, is there anything they can do? And eventually, as you mentioned, the hunger winter comes in late in 1944, and the people at that point who had survived, the civilians in Holland, began to suddenly see themselves what this brutality of the occupation was like. And my grandmother, my Oma, says she barely survived. She claims that if the war had lasted about 2 weeks longer, she would have starved to death.
Oh my gosh. There's something that you do that's a very profound way of kind of taking on that difficult inheritance of both survival and compromise, and that is to give over some of our focus and perspective to Will, Oma's grandson, and to think about his panic attacks, his struggles emotionally and sometimes physically, with something like a kind of epigenetic inheritance from starvation, from oppression, from sorrow, and to try and understand that as something that could manifest itself in someone. Could you talk a little bit about how you came up with that idea and then what you think of Will's character as influenced by this?
Yeah, thanks. So this was always something that was really important to me in the novel. I wanted to look at, obviously, the things that happened in the past, but I also wanted to see how they sort of ripple forward into the present day and affect, character generations later. So Mika in the novel is in the present day parts of the novel is an 80-year-old woman, and she is visited by her grandson while he's in the midst of sort of a personal crisis. He and his wife are trying to have a baby, and it's not been going well. And they're so sort of broken up about it that they're contemplating sort of separating. And what comes out in the novel, we discover that Will has some sort of hidden secrets about his own mental health and the mental health in his family that he's been hiding from his wife. And he himself is sort of torn about whether or not it would be a good thing if they were to have a child together, because he's worried about what he might be carrying forward on a genetic level. A lot of this came out of some research I did a long time ago about this. It was a book called Origins that was looking into the science of epigenetics, which is a relatively new sort of way of looking at, what I think most of us would call intergenerational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And normally when you talk about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about things like, how we are affected by the stories that we hear in our lives growing up. So, the narratives that we're told, if you are the descendant of, let's say Holocaust survivors, the stories you hear about the world and what a dangerous place it is and how threatening it is to you and your family, those become a part of your, perspective on the world, and they become wrapped up in your own fears and anxieties and so on, right? And so this is something I'd seen other writers, sort of exploring in novels, and I always found really fascinating. What I love about the epigenetic angle is that basically science is trying to find a way of looking at it from a genetic perspective. And so the studies that have been done, and in fact were done specifically on these survivors of the hunger winter. One of the first articles I found about the hunger winter was in the New York Times, and it was talking about the survivors being subjects in studies, epigenetic studies.
Mm-hmm.
And so what the scientists had found was that going through this sort of intense period of famine and starvation in this, what had otherwise been like a relatively, sort of healthy population, they were able to see the damage that was done to not just the people, but the people that survived to the trauma and the stress of going through this. It had affected their DNA and damaged it. And of course, that can then be passed forward, because once your DNA has been damaged, that replicated DNA replicates and is passed on to the next generation and the next. So they were able to see, sort of downstream effects in, adverse medical effects in the children of the hunger winter survivors and in their children, which would be me. So I was really fascinated by this idea. And I started writing about it from this perspective of, I'm going to finally sort of get to the bottom of, what's all the things that are wrong with me. And, it'll be this sort of interesting novel about, how these events from long before I was born, affect me today, or affect a character like Will today in the novel. And then as I wrote, I fell sort of towards a different perspective. The novel sort of taught me something in the writing of it, that's always sort of, I think, what I'm looking for. Because what I really much more was interested in actually was the lengths that Mika in the novel and in my real life grandmother had gone to survive, and the things that allowed her to survive. And sort of to realize that those things have been passed on as well, that our sort of ability to adapt and survive and get through trauma have also been passed forward. So the intergenerational trauma is there, but there's also sort of an intergenerational resilience that I was able to sort of start to see more clearly as I wrote.
That's beautiful. I like that very much. I'm very interested in the epigenetics of poverty and the way that it seems to carry on kind of in some ways, this idea of kind of starve and feast kind of back and forth, and to disable things in our genetics that we don't see.
Yeah.
But I love that idea of also carrying forth the will to survive, which I think is equally or if not more powerful than that idea of an inherited trauma. But I want to talk about Mika and Sherlock Holmes for a second.
Sure.
Obviously, I had some personal investment in the Holmes stories. But, Rob and Mika, they dearly love their collection of Holmes stories, and are, just as things are ramping up in the occupation, are wanting more of them. And Mika worries that Holmes has died, at the hands of Moriarty. And so we get this interesting parallel, both in Mika's detection of all these things that are going on. It's her that sees the disappearances and understands like who's being hidden, who is colluding with the Nazis in ways that seem to elude some of the adults even. And then later she'll describe, when so many people are hidden, it being a land of children, where the adults are either at labor camps, sent off to concentration camps, or hidden. So I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about the Holmesian interplay there with Mika.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Yeah, this was To be honest, the original sort of inspiration for Mika in this moment in the novel was my own love of Harriet the Spy when I was growing up.
Oh, I love Harriet the Spy so much.
My favorite book. I must have read it, 100 times at that age, and so I was trying to sort of imagine her as something like a Harriet the Spy in the novel, because she climbs into the fireplace to listen through the chimney to see what other people in the building are up to, and gets into the attic so that she can spy on her neighbor. But of course, that reference wouldn't work at all in the novel, as that book hasn't been written yet. And so I thought of Sherlock Holmes as sort of another sort of detective character that she could connect with, and that those books would have been widely available for in Holland at the time. And I love those mysteries as well, and I used to teach a class on detective fiction, so
Nice.
I sort of reached for that. But yeah, so she and Rob sort of fancy themselves as spies or detectives, and they kind of play at sort of almost imagining that they are members of the resistance, and that their job is to kind of suss out who in the building can be trusted and who can't. And in fact, I think there are 8 families living in the apartment building with them, including one family of Jewish family that disappears early in the novel, and she doesn't know what's happened to them. And then there's a family of Germans who fled before the war, so they're German nationals, but they've been living in Holland since before Hitler took power, so she doesn't know if she can trust them. And then there's a Dutch family who are, very vocal sympathizers. And she and Rob have to be able to kind of navigate between all those different groups as they figure out how to, find food and keep everybody safe and so on.
What does every USAA member have in common? Family. We're one big family who supports the military community and their eligible families. And if you, your parent, or spouse served, you could join our family and save big on auto insurance. Visit USAA.com/join today to check your eligibility. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso Virtuo Coffee Machines. Ready to enjoy the bold flavors of barista-quality Nespresso iced coffee at home? Simply fill a glass with ice and press the brew button on your Virtuo Pop machine to enjoy rich double espressos roasted to stand up even when chilled. Refreshingly bold iced coffee. Refreshingly easy to make at home. Visit Nespresso.com to shop now.
Yeah, I loved their detective work. Was one of my favorite things, and being able to sense those things. I want to do a pivot and talk about, you have this wonderful really thing to celebrate in your life, which is that you have 2 books out in the same calendar year, a very rare and wonderful thing. And the other one couldn't be more different in a way, although I'm sure it played heavily into writing and finishing your novel. But Revisionaries, what we can learn from the lost, unfinished, and just plain bad works of great writers, sort of models ideas of failing, and failing in particular like a genius, so that one might fail better or fail differently or not fail. And, there's Kafka and Butler and Fitzgerald and Ellison and Louisa May Alcott. But I wonder how this book came to be, and whether you'd give a couple of your favorite instances of geniuses failing.
Yeah, so this has been sort of a long-term project of mine. I started working on this, but actually before the novel existed, but I had been writing these columns for the website Electric Literature for quite a while now. And the focus was on unfinished novels, which I've just always been really curious about and fascinated by. I read in college, I read The Love of the Last Tycoon by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And as I talk about in Revisionaries, was just kind of fascinated by it. It's sort of not very good. And yet at the same time, maybe it has a lot of promise that was unfulfilled because he died before he could finish it. And it's just haunting to me, the idea of, sort of half a novel out there, sort of, never quite reaching completion. And I think in some ways, probably the source of a lot of my own anxieties as a writer, the drive to finish the book before it has to be left unfinished, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as I was writing those columns over the years, I started to, and I focused on, as you mentioned, all these different writers that I love and find inspiring. And one sort of thing that always comforted me in my research and in writing about them was that, you get to sort of show the vulnerable and very human sides of these writers, because these are often stories about things that they failed at. Truman Capote trying to write Answered Prayers and just, absolutely, but like crashing and burning, trying to write this book and, writing a book he knew he shouldn't have written, and then having it fall apart in his hands. And so it's stories like that. And then also maybe things like, the story behind Harper Lee's Go Set a Watchman, was sort of, pitched to people as sort of like a sequel to To Kill a Mockingbird. It eventually turned out to be sort of like a rejected first draft of To Kill a Mockingbird. And so through these stories, I started to realize like I was gaining so much, I guess just sort of appreciation for how these writers sort of faced these obstacles and when they came up, and oftentimes, they were able to overcome them eventually and move on to, the other great works that we know. And it gave me a lot of comfort. I'm a writer who, I'm very lucky. This is my third novel that has just been published here in the US. But I've written, like many other writers, I think I've written other books that, have been finished and yet probably will never see, the light of day in the world, for whatever reason, just didn't come together the way I wanted them to, or the publisher didn't like them, or whatever the problem may be. And when you face those kind of setbacks as a writer, you often, or at least I did, wonder if, or if your career is over, if you're finished, if that, you just spent all this time working on this book and no one seems to like it. Right? And it happens to all of us. And I would remind myself of that. And then I would see these, columns as I was working on them and realize like, okay, look, if this can happen to Jane Austen, if this can happen to, Sylvia Plath, and all these other great writers, then it's not the end of the world, right? Mm-hmm. So I started putting more of them together, and I wrote about 10 new columns over the last couple of years, and collected them together into this book. And my hope is that it will, be something that writers will want to, kind of turn to for inspiration and sort of reassurance. That even somebody who I consider all of these writers to be incredible geniuses, and they're people who I take so much inspiration from. But they're all human, and a lot of times their genius is really the result of of persevering through multiple failed drafts before they got to the thing that worked, or being able to sort of put aside a project that was not working and move on to one that was. And so being able to kind of see that, to me, almost it ultimately makes me even more impressed with these writers.
Absolutely. Do you know the South African writer Ivan Vladislavich?
No, I don't.
He has a book called The Loss Library, which is him reading his own failed or, things that never came into existence at all, or that he wrote and thought were failed. And I actually wrote a piece about it as a kind of, a form of the novel. Yeah. But if you're clearly, you would be interested in it. So I would say seek it out. It's with Seagull Press. And I think it's wonderful. He is amazing and underread, massively underread, especially in the United States. Okay. His opus novel is called The Restless Supermarket, which is about the transitional period in South Africa. And it's funny and all about language and error and unfinished things.
That sounds wonderful.
But before I let you go, Chris, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I wonder if you have any books you might want to recommend to my listeners.
Yeah, two that I've been reading recently that both have really left me a little breathless. The first one is another craft book, actually, or sort of essays on creativity by E. Lily Yu. And the book is called Break, Blow, Burn, and Make. It's just a really powerful, almost kind of like manifesto about the creative process and trying to urge us as writers to kind of, get back to different, I don't know, almost kind of like a different understanding of what makes us need to write and to write those things that we need to write and not to compromise our artistic ideals along the way, which is it just was something that I've been reading and it's really been kind of inspiring me a lot. And The other one that I read recently is a book called Mad White by Kate Hamilton. It's a memoir, and it's really very powerful. Sort of a memoir about surviving abuse in a marriage that it's really brilliantly written. The writing reminds me of like Carmen Maria Machado. And so I've been reading that and just really kind of being blown away by that.
Those sound great. I don't know either of them, but I will certainly seek them out. But I want to just encourage my listeners to run out and get Our Narrow Hiding Places and also the wonderful Revisionaries, both by Kristopher Jansma. And it's been such a pleasure to talk to you and to get a real feel for the real history that went into creating this fictional history and kind of all your ideas that kind of built up a world that I really wanted to spend time with Mika in. And I'm very thankful for that.
Thanks so much for having me on, Chris. It was so great to talk to you about it.
Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to Kristopher Jansma for coming on to talk about his novel of the Hunger Winter, Our Narrow Hiding Places, and his book of essays on how to fail like a genius, Revisionaries. You can find links to purchase both books and all of Chris's recommendations at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.